Your Honor, this isn't cruelty. The lease is dead. The market moved. I'm just collecting what's mine.
The date was the 11th of February 2026. My bailiff, Officer Martinez, called the case at 10:45 a.m., case 2026 VET90, The People versus Victor Thorne. I looked up from my docket and felt a crushing weight of reality just seeing the two men standing at the podium. On the left stood Victor Thorne. He was in his early 40s, wearing a tailored navy suit that cost more than some people's annual rent, and an Apple Watch Ultra that gleamed under the courtroom fluorescent lights. He stood with the posture of a man who believed execution is everything, a Silicon Valley mindset applied to the housing market of Rhode Island. He wasn't nervous, he was smirking, a man who viewed the courtroom as just another boardroom where he held all the controlling shares. He performed his authority as if he owned the building itself. Then, I looked to the right. My heart didn't just sink, it burned. Standing there was Sergeant Arthur Miller. He was 90 years old, and he looked like he was made of brittle parchment and old memories. Using the principles of reading a person's history through their features, I saw the deep-set wrinkles on his forehead, not just as signs of age, but as a physical map of a lifetime of service and current despair. His hands, resting on the wooden podium, were covered in age spots, and they shook with a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor. He wore an old, faded military field jacket with a purple heart pinned loosely to the lapel. It was the jacket of a man who had survived frozen trenches only to find himself freezing on the streets of the country he had bled for. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice intentionally low and steady, "you are here because you filed an emergency eviction against Mr. Miller for a property on 4th Street, a property he has lived in for 40 years. Thorne didn't even glance at the old man. "Your Honor, business is business," he said smoothly. "The lease expired. The neighborhood is pivoting to luxury lofts. I have investors to answer to. My company, my rules." I looked at Arthur Miller. He looked completely trapped, his eyes watery and dim, searching for a savior in a room full of strangers. "Sergeant Miller," I asked softly, "do you understand why you are here?" The old man cleared his throat, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. I just wanted to keep my books, Judge. They put my medals in a trash bag. I've got nowhere else to go." The information gap in the room was wide. Thorne saw a niche for profit. I saw an invisible killer named Greed, threatening to erase a hero's dignity. This wasn't just a trial. It was a doorway to a truth that was about to swing wide open. Thorne thought he was watching a routine procedure. He didn't realize he was about to witness a verdict that would become his worst nightmare. "Your Honor," Thorne began, adjusting the Apple Watch Ultra on his wrist as if syncing his heartbeat with his profit margins. "We need to look at this logically. I'm not a villain. I'm an investor. This property on 4th Street is part of Venture Living, a niche high-end development that will pivot the neighborhood toward luxury lofts, creating jobs and increasing the city's tax revenue. According to my business algorithm, keeping a non-paying tenant is a massive waste of resources." I looked down at Sergeant Miller. His thin shoulders were trembling under that old field jacket. This was the information gap Thorne would never understand. He knew the price of everything, but the value of nothing. He saw a niche for profit. I saw an invisible killer named Greed, threatening to erase a hero's dignity. "You talk about algorithms and waste," I interrupted, my voice dropping into a low, heavy silence that pressured the room. "How do you calculate 40 years of a man's life? How do you price the memories and the peace of someone who bled for this country?" Thorne smirked that condescending smile of a man who believes money can buy ultimate validation. "Judge Boyd, I know you're famous for empathy, but justice shouldn't be based on feelings. The lease expired. I gave 30 days notice. Legally, I am untouchable. Mr. Miller can't meet the current market rate. In my world, ideas are worthless without execution, and my execution is the optimization of this asset." I saw Officer Martinez clench his fists. The gallery held its breath. Thorne was using authority as performance to justify his cruelty. He called evicting a 90-year-old man optimization. This wasn't just a civil case. It was a moral battlefield. "So," I said slowly, staring directly into his Apple Watch, You consider throwing a veteran's Purple Heart into a trash bag to be part of your execution. Thorne's smirk faltered, but his authority narrative remained intact. That was a mistake by the clearing crew. I wasn't there. But, Your Honor, we can't let sentiment stop progress. The world is changing. Those who can't adapt get left behind. That's the law of the market. I looked at Sergeant Miller. A single tear traced a path through the deep-set wrinkles on his face, wrinkles Thorne saw as a sign of failure, but I saw as a map of honor. Thorne thought Miller was a loser because he didn't have $1 million portfolio, but I knew that Thorne was the one standing before a moral verdict he couldn't escape. I tapped my gavel. The sound was a warning. Your performance is over, Mr. Thorne. Now, let's see if your real world survives the truth I'm about to reveal. I leaned forward, the silence of the courtroom becoming a physical weight. Mr. Thorne, you spoke about optimizing assets. You spoke about pivoting toward the future. But you seem to have forgotten that the future is built on the foundations of the past. I pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume from the side of my bench, the original land deeds of the city of Providence. Thorne's lawyer tried to stand, but I silenced him with a single look. This was the information gap that Thorne's algorithms had ignored. This property on 4th Street, I began, my voice echoing like a verdict before it's even spoken. You bought it through a shell company during a municipal tax sale for pennies. You told your investors it was a distressed asset. But let's look at the hidden gems in this record. I opened the book to the year 1946. This house wasn't built by a developer. It was built by the hands of this community. After the war, the people of Providence didn't want their heroes returning to cold streets. They donated the timber, the bricks, and the labor. It was a gift of gratitude to the Miller family, specifically for Arthur's father, who survived the first wave at Normandy, and then for Arthur himself. Thorne scoffed. Historical sentiment doesn't change a tax lien, Judge. He failed to pay the city. I stepped in. That's execution. I looked at him, and I felt that shocking truth rising in my chest. Let's talk about that tax lien, Marcus. I had my clerk dig into the system error that caused it. It turns out the third-party billing company that manages the city's property tax notifications was acquired by your parent company 6 months before the lien was filed. The notices were never sent. The waste you saw was a crisis you manufactured. The gallery erupted in a wave of gasps. This was the coup twist Thorne didn't see coming. He hadn't just found a deal. He had engineered a trap. I watched as his confident smirk finally, utterly collapsed. He wasn't a visionary. He was a con artist in expensive clothes. You didn't execute a business plan, Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice like cold steel. You executed a robbery, and you did it while mocking the man whose home you were stealing. Arthur Miller looked up, his watery eyes widening. For the first time, the invisible killer was being dragged into the light. Your Honor, the lawyer stammered, his voice no longer smooth. My client acquired that billing company as a strategic move. Any clerical errors regarding tax notifications were surely unintentional. Administrative oversights. I didn't bang my gavel. I didn't need to. I just looked at him with 30 years of judicial weight. Counselor, don't insult my intelligence or this bench. We aren't talking about a clerical error. We are talking about premeditation. Your client didn't just buy a house. He engineered a tax default to steal it from a 90-year-old man who he knew wouldn't have the resources to fight back. This wasn't execution. This was a calculated ambush. I turned my gaze back to Thorne. You stood here and preached to me about how ideas are worthless without execution. You mocked Sergeant Miller for not being smart enough to stop you. But your entire execution was built on a lie. You performed authority, Marcus, but you never earned it. You used the power of your corporation as an invisible killer to strike at a man who was busy serving his country while you were learning how to manipulate spreadsheets. Thorne tried to stand up, his jaw tight. I followed the law. If the city lists a property for sale, I have every right to bid on it. That's how the real world works. Not in my courtroom, it isn't, I said, my voice cutting through his protest like a blade. The law is not a weapon for the strong to use against the weak. It is a shield. And today, I am turning that shield into a mirror so you can see exactly what you are. You aren't a visionary entrepreneur. You are a common thief who wears expensive shoes to hide the fact that he has no soul. I opened my folder to begin the first phase of the record-breaking penalty. This was a fraud committed with the intent to deprive a veteran of his only shelter. I find that your acquisition of the billing company and the subsequent failure to notify Mr. Miller constitutes a fraudulent concealment of material facts. Legally, the tax sale is void. But we aren't stopping there. We are going to talk about what this is going to cost you personally. Officer Martinez stood taller, his hand resting on his belt, sensing the shift in the room's energy. Thorne's lawyer sat down, essentially abandoning his client to the storm. Mr. Thorne, look at me, I said, my voice projecting with the authority of 30 years on this bench. You've spent this entire morning talking about optimization and pivoting. You've used the language of Silicon Valley to hide the actions of a common predator. You saw an old man's home not as a sanctuary, but as a niche profit opportunity. You saw his Purple Heart not as a symbol of sacrifice, but as a piece of clutter to be tossed into a dumpster. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto his Apple Watch Ultra. You think life is a game of execution? Well, today I am executing the law. First, I am declaring the tax sale of the property at 4th Street null and void because your company intentionally withheld the tax notifications through the billing firm you acquired. The sale was predicated on fraud. The title to the house is hereby restored to Sergeant Arthur Miller, effective immediately. A wave of relief washed over the gallery, but I wasn't finished. Second, we are going to talk about punitive damages. You engineered a crisis to steal a home. You caused a 90-year-old man to spend nights in fear and uncertainty. I am awarding Sergeant Miller $1 million in punitive damages for fraudulent concealment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. And because you boasted about your execution, I want that payment delivered by the end of the business day. Thorne's jaw dropped. Your Honor, that is justice. Marcus, I cut him off. But money isn't enough to fix what you broke. Now, I want you to turn around. Turn around and look at Sergeant Miller. Thorne hesitated, but Officer Martinez took a step closer, his hand resting on his belt. Slowly, Thorne turned to face the 90-year-old veteran. Arthur Miller sat there, his hands still shaking, his faded Purple Heart pinned to a jacket that had seen better days. Look at him, I commanded. Look at the man you called not smart enough. Look at the man you tried to turn into a waste of resources. This man bled for the ground you stand on. He spent 40 years building a life in a house that the community gave him as a gift of gratitude, and you tried to turn it into a luxury loft for people who haven't earned a tenth of the respect he has. Thorne couldn't hold the gaze. He looked at his shoes, the Golden Goose sneakers that cost more than Miller's monthly pension. You said ideas are worthless without execution, I reminded him, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a scream. Well, your idea was to exploit the vulnerable. My execution is to make sure you never forget the face of the man you tried to destroy. Mr. Thorne, you've spent your career building a brand on innovation and execution. Today, that brand undergoes a radical restructuring, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a scalpel. The third part of my ruling concerns your reputation, the very thing you valued more than a human being's life. Third, I continued, looking directly at the court reporter to ensure every word was etched into the record, you will issue a public statement approved by this court acknowledging that your attempt to evict Sergeant Miller was based on a manufactured crisis and fraudulent concealment of tax records. This statement will not be hidden in a press release. It will be posted on your company's homepage, your personal LinkedIn profile, and sent directly to every one of your venture capital investors. There will be no legal jargon, no administrative oversight excuses, just the simple, ugly truth. Thorne's lawyer surged to his feet. Your Honor, a public admission of fraud will trigger a moral turpitude clause in his investment contracts. It could collapse his entire firm. Then let it collapse, I replied coldly. A firm built on the theft of a veteran's dream is an invisible killer in our society, and I have no interest in keeping its heart beating. If his execution was so brilliant, he should have no trouble executing a recovery from his own dishonesty. I turned my focus back to the shivering CEO. Fourth, community service. You will not be serving on a charity board or attending a gala. You will serve 1,000 hours of community service right here in Providence, not Silicon Valley. You will spend your Saturdays for the next 2 years teaching coding and financial literacy to underprivileged youth, the very people you think aren't smart enough to be on a Forbes list. You will teach them how to protect their ideas from people like you. And your company will pay for every laptop, every textbook, and every piece of equipment they need. I saw the twist of fate finally settle on his shoulders. The man who wanted to pivot a neighborhood into luxury lofts was now legally mandated to empower the people he tried to displace. What you're feeling right now, Marcus, isn't just a legal defeat. It is the information gap between the man you pretended to be and the man you actually are finally being closed. You thought Sergeant Miller was an obstacle to be optimized. Today, he is your supervisor. This is insane. Thorne finally found his voice, but it wasn't the smooth, calculated tone of a CEO. It was the shrill cry of a man who realized his money had no power here. You can't do this. This is government overreach. You're a small-town judge who doesn't understand how the real world works. This ruling will be overturned in 5 seconds by any competent appeals court. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't bang the gavel. I simply let his words hang in the air until the silence became more deafening than his shouting. The real world, Marcus? I asked quietly, leaning forward so that only he and the front row could hear the edge in my voice. In your world, the strong prey on the weak and call it execution. In your world, a veteran's Purple Heart is just clutter for a dumpster. But you aren't in your world anymore. You are in mine. Thorne slammed his hand on the mahogany table, a desperate act of simulated authority. You're a joke. This whole proceeding is a joke. I turned to my bailiff, Officer Martinez. Martinez, who had been waiting for this moment since the second he saw Thorne's smirk, stepped forward instantly. Mr. Thorne, you are now in contempt of court, I said, my voice as cold as the steel, about to be placed on his wrists. You've spent this morning mocking this bench, mocking a hero, and now you've disrupted my courtroom. You'll spend the next 48 hours in county jail thinking about the difference between a businessman and a thief. What? You can't! Thorne backed away, looking at his lawyer, but the lawyer had already closed his briefcase and looked away. The twist was final. The man who wore Golden Goose sneakers to look down on others was forced to turn around and place his hands behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent room like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Take him into custody, bailiff, I ordered. As Martinez led him toward the side door, Thorne looked back at Sergeant Miller one last time. He wasn't smirking anymore. He was staring at the man he tried to destroy, realizing that while he had the capital, Arthur Miller had the soul. You didn't ruin your life because of an app or a house, Marcus, I said as the door began to close. You ruined it the moment you decided someone else's dream was yours to take. 6 months after the handcuffs clicked on Victor Thorne's wrists, I found myself driving down 4th Street. I usually keep a professional distance, but this case was different. It had become a moral of the story that stayed in my desk drawer. The house looked different. The peeling paint was gone, replaced by the same sturdy colors it wore in 1946. The neighborhood hadn't pivoted into luxury lofts for the elite. Instead, it had pivoted back to its roots. The community had come together once again, donating their time to fix the porch and replant the garden. I saw Sergeant Arthur Miller sitting on a brand new wooden chair on that porch. He wasn't shaking as much. He was holding a book, and for the first time since he walked into my courtroom, he looked like a man who was finally at peace. Victor Thorne had completed the first 200 hours of his community service. My program director told me that Thorne was actually becoming a decent teacher. Once he stopped trying to be the smartest person in the room and realized that execution without ethics is just a fast track to a jail cell, he started to see the information gap in his own life. He was no longer the Silicon Valley predator. He was just a man learning the true cost of a $3,000 suit. I sat in my chambers that evening and pulled out a letter Sergeant Miller had sent. It didn't have legal jargon or talk about asset optimization. It simply said, "Your Honor, thank you for seeing me when the world chose to look through me. You taught me that justice isn't just for the people with money and power, it's for everyone." I folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. This is why I still sit on this bench. Because somewhere out there, there is always going to be a Marcus Thorne, someone who thinks their power makes them untouchable, someone who thinks they can take what isn't theirs and get away with it. But there is also always going to be an Arthur Miller, someone with a dream, a history, and a heart that deserves to be protected. In my courtroom, the story always ends the same way. The Sergeant Millers win every single time.